As I said, it was primarily his poetry which reached me. I'm more of a person of the word than I am a person of the image. Although images are important to me, uh, they're more self-generated images rather than commercialized images hitting me. Not that James's films were commercialized, just the opposite. But films is not a medium that speaks to me greatly. As I mentioned, my first introduction to James was through his films. As I said, I marveled at them. It's called The Song of the Bed, and there's no clue here when it was written, but I have been informed from a good source that it was written after the film The Bed. Oh, everything important in life occurs upon a bed. It's where you cry when you're born and where you lie when dead. You spend a third of your life in bed with sickness, sex, and sleeping. You can have a you can have a good laugh with your love in bed, though it's also used for weeping. Yes, indeed. It's a bed. It's in a bed. Most fantastic things are hoped for and conceived. It's where you dream. It's where you scheme. It's where you are deceived. It's where on earth you come to birth. It's where on earth you come to birth. And most of childhood spent. It's where you come and where you don't. And where you come to an end. The Song of the Bed by James Broughton. So true. So true. I always used to marvel when I was younger and was not living a life of involuntary celibacy, that many times having a little bit too much wine to drink at a party or someplace, and many times the man I went to bed with at night was not the same man I woke up with in the morning after the alcohol wore off. The bed is truly a marvelous place. It was said during World War II, Prime Minister Winston Churchill many times would disappear. And he would be gone for 2 or 3 hours at a time, where people did not know where he was at. And they finally would find him in bed sleeping. And I always liked that. Some people say, well, he was a depressive, blah, blah, blah. It might have been. I think it was much more. It was a place where it renewed him. It does certainly me. If I'm confused about something, upset about something, I head to my bed, pull the covers up over myself, and let something else incubate me for a little while, and I wake up and I'm renewed and ready to go. You know, in James and Joel's relationship, it was a real pleasure just to see them in a room, to experience them together. Not that there weren't rough patches now and then that they had to skate over or something else, but you could see by the way they treated each other that they truly cared for each other, that their connection was a deep one. They loved each other deeply. It was a subject-subject relationship. They fed each other in ways that could be imagined and maybe unimagined. It was a wonderful relationship to see. The few times I was around them for an extended period of time, like they would come to Los Angeles or something, and they would stay with us at the Radical Ferry Sanctuary where Harry Hay, John Burnside, I, and Michael Fleming lived. And I'd be around them for 2 or 3 days. It was very obvious that they deeply loved each other, cared for each other, looked out for each other in wonderful ways. The way Harry Hay talks about it, and I think he's right, Whitman talked about it the same way. That Whitman talked in his poetry that there are 2 types of consciousness. There is amative consciousness, which some people associate with heterosexuals, or people in that part of the forest. And then there was something that he called adhesive consciousness, which dealt with another kind of consciousness that some people carry. Whitman himself never went to the extent of explaining it further than that. But those scholars of Whitman's poetry who study this find those 2 words throughout his poetry used in the context of a certain kind of consciousness. I think Harry, when he talks about one of the things that differentiates gay men from heterosexual men, is the consciousness we carry. That heterosexual men or heterosexuals generally carry a subject-object consciousness. It's me and you are different than me, subject-object. And that consciousness shapes much of heterosexual relationships. Where gay men carry a more subject-subject consciousness. It's same union and consciousness. That men are not these strange creatures that we don't know, but that men, or particularly gay men, other gay men, are a part of a tribe that we know about. And so when we talk about certain things, we understand it in a way that maybe we don't with our heterosexual friends. It's what Harry meant by subject-subject consciousness. One of the ways in which we as gay men probably are different than our beloved heterosexual brothers and sisters. I'm a Jungian psychologist here in Los Angeles, working largely with gay men, but not entirely with gay men. And I work with people out of my home, out of my living room, where one whole wall is a bookshelf. And many times when I'm working with a patient, there will be a dream image. There will be something they'll say. There's something that I hear in an echo or between words, and I say, oh, that reminds me of a James Broughton poem. And I scurry to my bookcase and spend 10 minutes trying to find the poem, locating it, and then reading it to them, and maybe allowing them to take the book of poetry home with them and bring them back next week. That there's a way that what James is tapping into, I think, is the collective gay unconscious, the collective unconsciousness, period. And then there's a room in that collective unconscious marked gay men. And he is connected with that in some way. One of the things that I studied when I was at UCLA, I was getting a doctorate in African and Islamic history, and was also interested in linguistics and was studying Semitic languages. One of the things I learned was the levels of meaning in a word, which makes the poetic tradition in Semitic languages just a delight, because there's so many different levels of understanding the words that are being used. And James's poetry reminds me a little bit of that. When the poem where he was having a dialogue with the sea, and she says, well, you have to go deep for that. And I had the sense that he was willing to do that, to go deep. And his poetry reflects that. And so sometimes people will read his poetry at a certain level and laugh and get something from it. And other people will read it and they're next to tears, in terms of reading something which reflects their own experience, or reflects an image which they had in a dream, or reflects something synchronistically like that. That's one of the ways that I use it. I also, for the last 25, 30 years here in Los Angeles, anytime I do anything public, and sometimes privately, but do anything in the gay community, I've gotten into the habit of creating sacred space. And I say to people, this is something that you're probably not used to. Our ancestors did it all the time. But there's the understanding that when you're talking about or dealing with something of great importance, you don't do that in ordinary space. You create extraordinary space, sacred space, in order to do that. And so there's always a little ritual, simple. One of the things I do in creating that sacred space is having somebody read what I call an ancestor voice, bringing the ancestors into the room. And it's usually between Whitman, Ginsberg, and James Broughton that I select a poem. Mary Oliver recently, where I select a poem that represents the ancestor's voice coming into the room. And so I use James's poetry in that way. It might depend on what we're doing. What the gathering is about, that would depend on the poem I select. Or to tell the truth, most often the poem selects me. It tells me which one to be read. But that's some of the ways that I use James's poetry. That's why I said earlier, death ends a life, it doesn't end a relationship. James is as alive in my life today as he was when he was walking this earth. Jung often said that a therapist can only take a patient as deep as the therapist himself or herself has gone. And I think there's truth to that. That the level at which we dialogue with somebody many times reflects the depth to which we've gone in our own lives. And I think James is one of those people that when he was involved in Jungian analysis, and afterwards, that always kept it going a little deep. What's around that corner? What's around that corner? I could hear him saying. That he kept going down there. And when you go down to the bottom of the ocean, you find wondrous things that you never knew existed. But you have to be willing and courageous enough to go down there. Or stupid enough. That's why I said James is a good village idiot. He's stupid enough to allow himself to go down into those depths. It reminds me of a public television program several years ago that they were doing on octopi and octopuses and that family of sea creatures. And they were looking at the flora and fauna around ocean volcanoes. There are eruptions in the ocean, and flora and fauna develop around these volcanoes, and they were looking at them deep, deep, deep in the ocean. They had to use a bathysphere to go down there. And for the first time ever, they captured on film two octopi, having sex. And the scientists were very excited by this. Never before had this been seen because they're out of sight. It's not like you can recreate this in the laboratory and then film it. And they sent the film off to one of the leading researchers on octopuses. And she wrote back saying, well, these were not heterosexual octopuses. These were two males having sex down there at the bottom of the ocean. So even down there in the depths, we'll find this queer life still going on. And James was like that. He could see the queer life no matter what level of the ocean he was working in. And I think it's one of his gifts that he was a seer. He could see things that many times other people would miss. Little things, like the poem about the bed. He could have a relationship with, he could see things about the bed that most of us don't see or don't stop enough or aren't quiet enough or haven't gone deep enough to be able to see.
I'm